Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video. There's no doubt about it, shooting in the harsh midday sun can be a challenge for the photographer. Do you have trouble getting nice colors and soft tones in harsh midday sun? And are your highlights all blown out and pure white? In this video, I'm going to give you some tips to protect against those harsh rays, but also some tips on how to embrace them and get them working for you, not against you. Stick around for my bonus tip where I'll teach you how to get the right exposure in bright light so I can take photos like this, even in bright daylight, without blowing out my whites. My name is Simon D'Entremont and I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. Right before we get into tips, let me briefly explain what the problem we're trying to solve here is, so my advice later will make sense. The issue here is that on bright sunlit days, the difference between the brightest tones in your image and the darkest tones in your image is too great for your camera sensor to capture. Our eyes can squint and move around the scene to see different tones of bright and dark, but our camera needs to capture it all at once. Most cameras can only see 10 to 13 stops of dynamic range, that is the difference in tones between lights and darks. Let's say from here to here on this histogram. But in full bright sun, the brightest parts extend beyond what the camera can capture, so we end up with blown out whites. Colors also look muted when overly bright. You lose the beautiful saturation when too bright, and they look more colorful with a more natural brightness level. So what can we do about this? My first tip to handle that overly bright sun is to shoot in the shade. While that doesn't sound like brain surgeon advice, there's a few different ways we can do this. Not all shade is created equal. First, we can simply go to a shady area, like indoors or behind a building. Note though that if you pick your shade correctly, you can get light reflected from a nearby building and get a more softly lit scene that isn't so dark. So pick your shady area with this consideration. Another shady area would be under the canopy of the trees. This can provide a very nice light as the leaves will filter the harsh light, but leave enough for properly illuminating your scene. Here's a bird photo of mine taken under the canopy of the trees. Notice the light is soft and there are no harsh shadows to deal with, which makes getting the right exposure easy. Trees can also give you a nice effect with dappled light, varying in intensity and brightness, but no dark darks and bright lights. Easy to capture and gives a neat look. Also, keep an eye out for the scenario where the subject is in the shade but the background is in the sun. This is my favorite effect in wildlife photography and leads to a wonderful look like in these photos of mine. Note the lack of shadows on the subject and the cool look of the subject against a bright, warm background. My second tip about shooting in the bright sunlight is to shoot the shady side of your subject. When you have a chance to move your subject or get the shady side of your subject, the harshness of the sun will be minimized and the tones and shades of your subject will be much softer. Your subject can look quite dark though. You can get some extra light on your subject with an LED panel or a reflector for some natural light. You can actually use a flash in bright daylight too, which may seem counterintuitive. You can fill in the shadows and allow your overall exposure to be darker, taming those highlights. Keep the flash power low. You're looking to fill in the shadows, not brightly expose your subject. That being said, you may end up in a backlit situation where the background and foreground may be very different brightness. If the background is much brighter than your subject, you need to decide, do I sacrifice the background to get the subject properly exposed, or do I expose for that bright background and have my subject be dark in the frame? Backlighting is both tricky and an amazing opportunity for dramatic photos, like these photos of mine. If you want to learn more about how to shoot in backlit situations, sign up for my email list and you can download my guide to shooting in backlit situations for free. Link in the comments below. Another type of shade could be one you create, like taking portraits under a translucent umbrella. You can include this in the scene or have someone hold it just out of view. If you can't find shade, make your own. You can also put up some fabric or sheer curtains in front of a large window, which takes the harsh edge off the light but still leaves enough to work with. Another tip for harsh light is one that landscape photographers use all the time, which is waiting it out. That means going to a great location and scoping out a great composition, but not taking photos yet. After their favorite composition has been selected and the camera and tripod set up, the next step is to wait. Softer tones at sunset or a passing cloud or maybe even some passing mist can cut into that bright sun. That's what I did last week on a trip to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Once I had my composition, I could simply have taken this shot, but by waiting for a bit, some mist and some clouds allowed me to get this shot instead. So after you've looked at all these strategies to manage the bright sunlight, let's say you're stuck with it and have no other choice but to shoot in the bright sun. What do you do then? Here are some tips. My first piece of advice when you're stuck with bright sunlight is to use it to your advantage. That is, look for ways for the bright light to make the shot, not ruin it. Can you have a scene make more sense if it was brightly lit with sun? Maybe the message in your photo is that it was unbearably hot today, or that this was taken in a hot climate. Silhouettes are another way to get that bright light to be part of the photo. Can your subject be dark and moody against a bright background? Note that silhouettes work best if it's clear from the outline what your subject is, like in this elephant photo of mine. Getting an angle to your subject such that the silhouette reveals its identity is a great trick. Harsh light and shadows can also work well in architecture photography, where you focus on the shapes more than the details. What's your favorite tip for shooting in harsh light? Let me know in the comments below. If you just want to try and get the photo but the light is harsh, one option is to use the HDR function available in many cameras by shooting bracketed exposures to achieve a photo of high dynamic range. What this means is taking one photo properly exposed, one brighter, and one darker. On my camera, this is accessed by choosing the exposure compensation indicator on the back of the LCD and turning this wheel. You'll see it chooses 3 exposures and can adjust how far apart in exposure they are. Then take 3 photos. Your post-processing software, like Lightroom that I use, can combine the different exposures by using the bright parts of the darkest exposures and the dark parts of the lightest exposures to make one photo that combines the best of all the shots. Note that this can leave the photo without much contrast and look a bit lifeless. You can get some life back into the photo by increasing the contrast and getting some shadows and highlights back into the image like in real life. Another way to tame bright light if you're stuck dealing with it is to use a polarizing filter, which specifically reduces reflected light, like from water or shiny surfaces like bright cars or wet leaves. A circular polarizer is one where you can rotate it to get different levels of correction, and you can use it to experiment with different effects. Here in this car photo, I can rotate the filter to get the reflections to look different, giving me different creative choices. Maybe the reflections add to the photo rather than detract from it. A polarizer can also bring some color back from the sky, like deeper blues and more contrasty clouds. And I promised you a bonus tip. If you're stuck shooting in really bright light, try exposing for the brightest parts to preserve them. That usually means shooting the photo overly dark and underexposed, but just short of blowing out those highlights. You can then raise the shadows in post-processing to make the photo closer to what you wanted. A couple of tips to get that exposure right though. First, use your histogram and expose the photo so that the brightest parts, represented here, are just short of touching the right side of the histogram, as anything touching the right side would mean that the whites are blown out. Secondly, use highlight alerts, which we call blinkies, that tell you when you've clipped the whites and overexposed them. Take a test shot and check them on your back LCD. If they blink, reduce the brightness of your exposure. If you like that last tip but would like to learn more about using a histogram, check out my video on that topic, which you can see right here. If you thought this video deserving, give it a like and YouTube will share it with even more photographers, helping them grow in this great hobby. I hope you can use these tips the next time you go out in bright sunlight and still come home with great photos. I know you can do it.